Hello, grade 12s. Welcome back. Just before the short break, we were looking at accountability in the public sector and just saying it's important that the public servants are aware that they will be held accountable to explain why they've made certain decisions, but also to explain as well if they had been found guilty of other things that could be considered unethical in that particular sector. So we are now going to move on to efficiency. So we've looked at accountability, that also we as the public do hold the government accountable in terms of delivering services, quality services that it is. So we hold them accountable for that. But now, how do we improve the efficiency? Because that's quite a touchy issue when you come to the public sector. So now the first part that we're going to look at, the efficient provisioning, which refers to public servants provide the public with goods and services promptly and the desired quantity and quality. So it means that we get a good service and we get good products from the public sector. And also when we are interacting with public servants, they should always be in a position to provide us with goods and services, promptly, and also the desired quantity and quality. Do we always get that? Well, that's debatable. Maybe that's something that you can have as part of your class discussion, and you can share the experiences and the different encounters that you've had when visiting some of the public offices around town. Then we're going to move on to the inefficient provisioning as well. So now public servants fail to deliver services to the public. Okay, so now we've looked at what the ideal situation should be, where we get good services and we get the desired quantity and quality, but that's not always the case. So what could be stopping the public servants, in delivering this quality service? There are a number of things, okay? So the processes that hold up, because in government, Director A, let's just say Director A has to sign this and send it to Director B, and then from Director B, it must go to Director C, and then eventually D will have to then implement. So the different processes that are in place and these forms and this stamp, and then take it to that office, and that office, hold up the process, and then the public servants are then now perceived to be incompetent because it's taking way too long. The steps that are involved in ensuring that the service or a product is completed just take way too long because of the different people that have to authorize and verify and validate. So the bureaucracy around that is huge. And then it results to incompetence, and obviously corruption is a huge issue in the public sector. And you see that on the news on a daily basis, the amount of corruption that they have to deal with. Assessing of needs. So government provides goods and services according to the needs of people. So assessing these needs is difficult, okay? So because, of the research or the information or the data that is available to government, so they are unable to provide these needs because they don't have the information. There isn't proper, thorough research that gets done and feed it back to the government in order to allocate the resources accordingly. So now they find themselves struggling to provide the goods and services because the needs of the people aren't assessed properly. And it does make it difficult for the government to provide goods and services. The market forces as well play an important role because they determine the price of goods and services in the private sector. Okay, so that makes it a challenge because we know that in the private sector, we work with the market forces of supply and demand. And then when they determine the prices, then government has to take that price when looking at purchasing certain goods and services from the private sector, because they work on the system of supply and demand. And then the state enterprises are not subjected to the forces of demand and supply. You know, that's another challenge, and hence why so many of them are not actually making a profit, because they know that they are not subjected to the forces of demand and supply. And then we know with the national carrier, the issues that they've had to try and stay or keep alive, for lack of a better word, because they now rely on a cash injection from the government in order to continue offering that particular service. So the fact that they are not subjected to the forces of demand and supply actually does not push them to study the market quite well and to offer competitive pricing in case or in order to stay in the business, whereby here the market forces play an important role in determining the price, and then the government has to take that because that price is made in the private sector. So they find themselves with no option but to take the price. Okay, let's go back. There we are. Okay, so now we're going to look at the pricing policy. So the free of charge, certain services are provided free of charge from taxes, e.g. public health services. The tax revenue is used to cover the costs. So we know that if you want to go to a public hospital or to a public clinic, you don't have to pay a fee. So we call that a free of charge service because that money is recovered from the tax revenue. So when you contribute your income tax, that money is used to provide such services. And then the price value, it is difficult for government to establish the correct pricing. It's easier in the private sector because they work on the supply and demand principle. And now remember, I said earlier on, in the public sector, they are not subjected to that, particularly the state-owned enterprises or the parastatals. So the pricing policy also plays an important role in the problems that are encountered by the public sector. The fact that they're not working on supply and demand to work out their pricing, end up in a position where they find themselves with a whole lot of issues that are related to pricing. And then looking at paid services, so people pay for some services, for example, the TV licenses. I hope that you are being a responsible citizen and paying for your TV license. So the national broadcaster looks at or relies on this in order to meet some of their operational expenses. So it is a paid service, but also the pricing is also an issue, because how do they determine that we have to pay a certain amount at the end of each month when they are not looking at the issue of supply and demand in order to determine what price they should be charging for that particular service? And then we have subsidized products. The public pay less for goods because government does subsidize or pays towards the cost. For example, the price of bread is being subsidized by government because it is seen as a basic necessity, something that people should have access to. So they do subsidize that so that a loaf of bread is not overpriced. And we find ourselves in a situation where we have people that can't really afford to pay or access that basic product. Okay, so these are some of the important terms that we need to know. The price value relates to the supply and demand. Products that are offered free of charge because that money is recovered from tax revenue. And then there are some paid services like the TV license. And then we also have subsidized products where the government makes a contribution towards the cost so that those prices could be accessible to the majority of the citizens. And then we come across the parastatals, businesses that are partly owned by the state and private entities or private individuals. And then we have what we call a state-owned enterprise. We did come across this in our introduction earlier on in the lesson, also known as the SOEs, can be created as a result of nationalization. So we know, like with the South African Airways, it's a national carrier, and it's associated with the nation. It's the nation's pride. My choice of words is quite interesting. Because they want to nationalize that particular industry or sector, then we might then look at introducing a state-owned enterprise. And then service provisioning. So SOEs support service delivery. Remember, the government has a mandate to deliver certain services to the public. So the SOEs will help the state in providing some of these services. For example, Eskom, we know that will be the electricity, and SABC, that's the national broadcaster, and then they'll be providing TV channels and radio stations as well. And then Transnet, we know with our railway line, access to trains as a mode or of transport. And these can lead to monopolies, high prices, and inefficiency. And then here we're sitting with this company called Eskom over here. They have a monopoly. We know that they charge high prices, and sometimes they can be inefficient. Okay, so that's just an example, because it has improved with load shedding, but now and then we still experience that. But the price hike is really high because they are a monopoly, so there aren't other competitors in that market space that can come and play the competition or be a competitor against Eskom. Then we've got the infrastructure provisioning. So SOEs provide the essential infrastructure, especially when there are insufficient funds in the private sector. For example, the road network. So the SOEs will help in the infrastructure provisioning because there will be insufficient funds in the private sector in order to carry out that service delivery or the delivery of that particular service, and therefore we are going to rely on the SOEs in order to deliver that service. Then we come across limited liability. SOEs have limited liability in South Africa because they are financially supported by government. So those that do business studies will know this concept of limited liability when we look at the different types or forms of ownership. We know that companies have limited liability and the sole trader and the partnerships have unlimited liability, which means that the business is not seen as a legal entity on its own. So if it's a partnership, the partners are jointly and severally liable for paying back what is owed to creditors. And also we know that a sole proprietor has unlimited liability as well. But here SOEs have what we call limited liability. So the investors or the owners of the SOE can only lose what they've invested in the business, and their private assets may not be seized in order to recover money that is owed to creditors. So that's just some interesting terminology that you need to be aware of there. And then we often hear why does government should privatize SAA because they're not doing well and they always rely on a cash injection from the government, or they should nationalize the mines. So let's just try and understand those concepts. What does it mean? So privatization refers to the transfer of functions and ownership from the public to the private sector. The aim of privatization is to reduce the relative size of the public sector. And we know there's been a debate about SAA, whether it should be privatized or not. So what are some of the advantages of actually privatizing some of the services that are offered by the public sector? So some advantages of privatization. So it stimulates economic growth and it improves the overall efficiency of performance of the economy. Privatization provides additional funds to the government, and then they can use that to further develop the infrastructure. And then privatization attracts foreign investment because they'll be skeptical to invest if it is an SOE. And the nationalization, it is the opposite of privatization. It is the process whereby the state takes control of ownership from privately owned assets, because we've been hearing the nationalization of mines as a way of growing or stimulating the economy. Some argue that state-owned enterprises, for example, like Eskom, should be privatized. I gave you an example earlier on with SAA that, some say that the national carrier should be privatized. Oh, well, let's sum up our lesson. So today we learned about the public sector, a term broadly used to include all agencies which make up the government. We also learned about public goods, those goods and services that are provided by the state for the use by all members of society. So you need to know what a public sector is and what are public goods, because we have been referring to public goods in our lesson. We also spoke about parastatals. These are state-owned enterprises that provide public goods and services on behalf of government. We looked at market failures, a situation that arises in the economy where the free market forces of demand and supply fail to lead to an efficient allocation of resources, because we're looking at, what are some of the challenges that are faced by the public sector when it comes to providing the basic goods and services. So what are the external factors that contribute to the problems or to the market failure? So these are the benefits or the costs which result from the production of a good or service, but which are not reflected in the price of the product. Okay, so we call them the externalities of the production system. Oh, well, that's a wrap of today's lesson. We trust that you've enjoyed and you've learned so much from this lesson. From me, Uspiwe, it's a wrap. Peace.